You little brat! Admiral Richard Voss slammed his fist on the tactical table and laughed in her face loud enough for the entire command tent to hear. You walk into my briefing in front of 60 senior officers and tell me my defense line is going to collapse. 5,000 soldiers turned to watch. The woman didn't step back, didn't blink. She looked straight at the most powerful commander at Redstone Base and said quietly and without apology, "Eastern Line. 11 minutes. Watch it fall." The Admiral laughed again. He had no idea that laugh would cost him everything he thought he knew about command. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shock you. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The briefing had been running for 40 minutes when Colonel Elena Hayes arrived. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She simply opened the side door of the main command tent at Redstone Military Base, stepped inside, and stood near the back wall with a tablet in one hand and a folder tucked under her arm. Nobody stopped her. At first because nobody noticed her, and then because the people who did notice her assumed she was someone else's problem. The tent was packed. More than 60 senior officers, tactical advisors, logistics coordinators, and communications specialists crowded around the central display table. Admiral Richard Voss stood at the head of it, filling the room with his voice, his posture, and the particular brand of authority that comes from 22 years of never being told no. He was in the middle of explaining the second phase deployment when one of his aides leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Voss paused. He looked up. He found Elena standing near the back wall. "Who let you in here?" he asked, not hostile yet, just confused the way a man is confused when he sees something that doesn't belong in his world. Elena didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the tactical display, her head tilted slightly to one side, studying the formation patterns with the focused attention of someone who had seen far too many of these layouts go catastrophically wrong. "I said," Voss repeated louder now, "who let you in?" She looked up. "I let myself in." The room shifted. It was a small shift, the kind that happens when the air pressure changes before a storm, invisible but felt by everyone. 60 officers exchanged glances. Aides straightened. The man standing to Voss's left actually took a small step backward, as though he wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. Voss stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled. "You're lost, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement men like Voss make when they've already decided what they're looking at and don't feel the need to look any harder. A young woman in a plain uniform, no medals, no insignia that caught his eye. A tablet and a folder. She looked to him like a mid-level administrative officer who had confused one tent for another. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Elena said. Something rippled through the room again. Not quite amusement, not quite discomfort. Something in between. Voss walked toward her. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, and he moved through crowds the way people move through crowds when they've spent decades having everyone step aside for them. When he stopped in front of her, the height difference was considerable. He looked down at her the way a man looks at something he's already dismissed. "This is a restricted command briefing," he said. "Senior officers and cleared personnel only. Whatever you need, whatever department you're from, this isn't the place." "Eastern Defensive Perimeter," Elena said. Voss blinked. "The secondary grid," she continued, her eyes going back to the tactical display even as she spoke to him. "The one your 3rd Battalion is anchoring at coordinates Delta 7. There's a 7-minute window after communication rotation where that position has no air coverage and no ground response capability. If this exercise goes live and an opposing force identifies that window—" "Excuse me." Voss's voice had dropped. The amusement was gone. "Did I ask for your analysis?" "No." "Then stop giving it." "The Eastern Line will collapse," she said simply, as though he hadn't spoken. "I wanted you to know before the exercise started, not after." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Elena had heard in years. Voss turned to face the room. He looked at his officers. He looked at his aides. Then he turned back to Elena with an expression that had passed through confusion and irritation and arrived somewhere that looked very much like performance. "You little brat," he said, and he laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that fills a room, loud and certain, and designed to make everyone else laugh too. Several officers smiled. A few chuckled quietly. One aide near the door actually looked at the floor, trying to keep his face neutral. "Do you even understand who you're speaking to?" "Admiral Richard Voss," Elena said. 22 years of service, 3 distinguished command citations, the Blackwood Campaign, Northern Theater Operations years 11 through 14. Yes, I know who you are." The laughing stopped. Voss studied her for a moment with different eyes, not dismissive eyes, recalibrating eyes. "Then you understand," he said carefully, "that when I say this briefing is restricted—" "I'm not here for the briefing," Elena said. "I'm here for the exercise. You're not on the participant list." "I'm not a participant." "Then what are you?" She looked at him. "I'm the evaluation." Nobody moved. Admiral Voss held her gaze for 4 full seconds. Then he exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled the way a man exhales when he's made a decision and wants everyone in the room to see that the decision cost him nothing. "Sergeant Holloway," he said, raising his voice toward the door. A guard appeared. "Escort this officer to the Administrative Processing Unit and verify her credentials. Then find out which command she belongs to and contact them directly." He looked at Elena one more time. "We'll clear this up quickly." "You won't find what you're looking for in the administrative unit," Elena said. "My orders are classified above your clearance level. What you can do is call the general's office directly and ask for confirmation." "Which general?" "Whitmore." Another silence. Different quality this time. General Marcus Whitmore was not a name you invoked casually at Redstone Base. He commanded the entire military region. He was 3 levels above Voss in the chain of command. He was also in the 22 years of Voss's career, someone who had never once intervened directly in a command exercise at this level. Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Holloway," he said again, his voice perfectly controlled. "Have someone verify her credentials through the General's administrative office. And in the meantime," he turned back to his display table, "get her out of my command tent." Elena didn't resist. She nodded once, tucked her folder back under her arm, and followed Sergeant Holloway toward the door. But just before she stepped through it, she stopped and turned back. "Admiral?" He didn't look at her. 11 minutes after the exercise begins," she said. "Eastern Line. Watch for it." Then she was gone. What happened in the next 45 minutes was, in the opinion of the officers who witnessed it, one of the more uncomfortable stretches of time in the recent history of Redstone Base. The verification call to General Whitmore's office took 8 minutes. Elena spent those 8 minutes standing outside the command tent in the open air, reviewing her tablet without apparent concern, while Sergeant Holloway stood nearby, looking increasingly like a man who wished he had chosen a different career. The officer who made the call came out of the communications unit 3 minutes after hanging up the phone. His face told Sergeant Holloway everything before he said a word. "She checks out," the officer said quietly. Holloway looked at Elena. Elena looked up from her tablet. "The Admiral is going to want to speak with you," the officer said. "I know," Elena said. "Let's go." The conversation that happened back inside the command tent was brief, and for the 60 people who witnessed it, extraordinarily informative. Voss took the credentials confirmation with the practiced composure of a senior officer receiving bad news in front of his subordinates. He read the summary. He looked at Elena. He looked at the summary again. "Colonel Hayes," he said. "Yes." "Your orders are from General Whitmore's office directly." "Yes." "To conduct an unannounced performance evaluation of command leadership at this exercise." "Correct." He folded the summary and handed it back to his aide. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Then you're welcome to observe," he said. "I run a strong command. We have nothing to hide." "Good," Elena said. Then this will be straightforward. She moved back toward her position near the rear wall, opened her folder, and uncapped her pen. Carry on with the briefing. Voss held still for one more second. Then he turned back to his tactical display and did exactly that. But every person in the room could feel it, the tension that had entered the space and decided to stay. The sense that something had shifted beneath the surface, the way the ground shifts before you feel the tremor, quiet and warning, and already too late to run from. Lieutenant Daniel Carter had been stationed at Redstone for 14 months. He was 29 years old, sharp-eyed, recently promoted, and possessed of the kind of careful observational instinct that made good officers, and more often, very isolated, junior personnel. He had watched the entire encounter from his position near the left side of the briefing table. He had watched Voss laugh. He had watched the room laugh with him. He had watched Elena stand absolutely still through all of it, not flinching, not arguing, not raising her voice even a fraction above conversational. And he had watched her eyes. That was what stuck with Daniel Carter as the briefing resumed and the exercise preparation moved into its final phase. Not her words, not her rank, not even the extraordinary moment when the confirmation came back from Whitmore's office and the entire mood of the room reorganized itself. Her eyes. Because when Elena Hayes stood in front of Admiral Voss and told him the Eastern Line would collapse, she wasn't angry. She wasn't anxious. She wasn't performing confidence the way junior officers perform confidence when they need someone to believe them. She simply knew. The way a person knows something they have seen happen before in other rooms with other men who laughed and other defense lines that collapsed exactly when and exactly how they had been told they would. Daniel found himself standing next to her during the equipment verification phase, going through the motions of his assigned checklist while she made notes in her folder. He wasn't sure what made him speak. Possibly the same instinct that had made him watch her eyes. "You've evaluated commands before," he said quietly, not looking up from his checklist. "A lot of them." Elena glanced sideways at him without turning her head. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're not nervous." She was quiet for a moment. "Should I be?" she asked. "The Admiral is angry." "Yes." "That doesn't concern you." She wrote something in her folder. "Lieutenant, the last time I was concerned about an admiral being angry at me, I was considerably younger and considerably less certain of what I was looking at." She paused. "I'm very certain of what I'm looking at." Daniel thought about that. "The Eastern Line," he said. "Yes." "You saw it in the briefing. I saw it in the preparation reports, 3 days ago." She turned a page in her folder. "I've been here longer than anyone at this base realizes." Daniel looked at her. "How long?" "Long enough," she said simply, and went back to her notes. 3 minutes into the exercise, the first mini-catastrophe happened, and it happened exactly where Elena had said nothing would go right yet. Not the Eastern Line, not yet. Something smaller, something that to an outside observer might have seemed like a minor communication hiccup during a training scenario. But Elena made a note, because she had seen this pattern before, in 3 other commands, in 2 different theater operations. The small failures always arrived first quiet and easily dismissed, and the commanders who dismissed them were always the ones who were completely unprepared when the large failure arrived. She found Sergeant Holloway near the communications array 15 minutes into the exercise. "When was the last scheduled maintenance check on frequency rotation for the secondary grid?" she asked him. Holloway blinked. I'm not certain, ma'am." "Find out for me." He hesitated. "The Admiral said—" "I know what the Admiral said," Elena told him. "I'm asking you, when was the last maintenance check?" He swallowed. He looked toward the command tent where Voss was visible through the open flap, watching his screens, looking certain. Then Holloway looked back at Elena. Something in her expression, or perhaps in the quality of her patience, made the decision for him. "I'll find out," he said. He was back in 4 minutes. 8 weeks ago," he said quietly. "They've been due for a rotation check for the past 3 weeks. It kept getting pushed back." Elena wrote it down. "Thank you," she said. Holloway watched her for a moment. Is it going to matter? Yes, she said. In about 23 minutes, it's going to matter considerably. He does. Voss found her at the 20-minute mark. He walked up to her from behind, which was the kind of thing powerful men do when they want to establish that they can approach without warning, that they are not required to prepare you for their arrival. Well, he said, we're 20 minutes in, and the exercise is running exactly to plan. Elena didn't turn around. Is it? Eastern line is holding. There was something in his voice, not quite satisfaction, not quite goading. Something precisely between the two. Perhaps your analysis was premature. The Eastern line has 31 minutes before the opposing force identifies the rotation window. Elena said. It's holding because they haven't started looking yet. Voss moved around to face her. He looked at her folder. You've been writing notes since the beginning, he said. Yes. About what? She looked up at him. About the culture of this command, she said. He frowned. What does that mean? It means, she said, that I've spent the last 20 minutes watching your junior officers identify problems and choose not to report them. I've watched your communications personnel dismiss a frequency irregularity that they noticed but assumed was their own error. I've watched 2 separate logistics coordinators alter their verbal reports before giving them to you. She held his gaze. Not because they were lying, because they were afraid. Voss was very still. Afraid, he repeated. Of your reaction, she said. Admiral, your soldiers are not afraid of failing. They are afraid of you finding out that they failed. Those are different fears and they produce different problems. The first makes people work harder. The second makes people hide information. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but changing the way a face changes when a man is receiving information that contradicts something he has believed for a very long time and isn't yet ready to decide how to respond to it. You don't know this command, he said. You've been here 20 minutes. I've been here 3 days, Elena said. I know this command better than you currently realize. He turned and walked away, but he didn't tell her to stop taking notes. Chaffarde. At 31 minutes and 40 seconds into the exercise, 4 seconds later than Elena's estimate, the Eastern defense line collapsed. It happened in the way things always happen when the warning has been given, and the warning has been ignored suddenly completely, and with the terrible clarity of something that was inevitable from the beginning. The opposing force simulation identified the rotation window. They moved through it before the 3rd Battalion could rotate coverage. The communication network hit its frequency gap at the exact moment it was most needed, and the secondary grid went dark for 7 minutes, during which 4 units on the eastern perimeter operated in isolation, couldn't coordinate response, and were by the standards of the exercise completely neutralized. The command tent erupted, not in the controlled professional eruption of a well-trained unit managing a crisis. In the chaotic eruption of 60 people trying to communicate through a system they had suddenly lost faith in, with an admiral standing at the center of it, demanding information that nobody could give him, because the channels that information was supposed to travel through had just stopped working. Get me eastern perimeter, Voss was saying. His voice hard, controlled on the surface, the way a frozen river is controlled smooth and rigid until you find the crack. Someone get me. Communication rotation failure on the secondary grid. Someone was calling from the bank of screens. We're dark on frequencies, 4 through 7, estimated restoration. I don't want an estimate, I want. Eastern perimeter is non-responsive. Then physically dispatch. Ground units are already engaged on the north approach. There's no one to... Elena stood at the back of the tent and watched. She did not move toward the display table. She did not offer advice. She simply watched and wrote and let it unfold. Because this was the moment the evaluation had always been about. Not whether the defense line would hold, she had known it wouldn't from the moment she read the preparation reports 3 days ago, but how the commander would respond when it fell. That was the question. That was always the question. And what she saw was this. Admiral Richard Voss was a man trying to solve every problem simultaneously, giving orders in multiple directions, demanding information from people who didn't have it, pushing harder and harder against a situation that was moving faster than his commands could follow. He was reacting. He was not thinking ahead. He was not anticipating. He was not listening to the people around him who had fragments of useful information that might have helped him see around the corner. He was simply pushing against the present moment with everything he had, and the present moment was winning. Around the 14-minute mark of the crisis, as the simulation showed 3 more units approaching isolation, and the communication blackout showed no sign of resolving, Voss turned from his display table. His eyes found Elena across the room. She didn't look away. He stared at her. She looked back. For a full 3 seconds, the room's noise continued around them. Officers shouting reports, systems emitting alerts, the exercise grinding through its simulated catastrophe, and Voss and Elena held each other's gaze across 20 feet of controlled chaos. Then Voss said something that, by the accounts of everyone who witnessed it, he had not said at a command briefing in 11 years. "Colonel Hayes," his voice cut through the noise. The room didn't go silent, but it quieted around him, the way rooms quiet when the most important person in them speaks at a frequency that says, "This matters." "Do you have a recommendation?" Elena closed her folder. She walked to the display table, and she went to work. She moved to the display table and nobody stopped her. That was the first thing Daniel Carter noticed. Not what she said, not what she did. The fact that 60 people, including the Admiral who had laughed at her 90 minutes ago, simply stepped aside and let her through. She didn't ask them to move. She didn't push. She walked to the center of the table and they parted around her, the way water parts around something that belongs in the current. And then she stood there with both hands flat on the table's edge and looked at the entire situation at once. Not at one screen, not at one crisis point, at everything simultaneously. "Talk to me," she said. For a half-second, nobody answered. The habit of a chain of command is a powerful thing, and the habit at Redstone said that nobody at this table reported to her. Then Voss said, "Talk to her," and that was the end of that. Eastern Perimeter 4 units neutralized by simulation protocol. The nearest officer said immediately, the words coming faster now that someone had opened the gate. "Northern approach has 3 active engagements. We've pulled ground response units to cover, which means the secondary support corridor is exposed," Elena said. "I know. What's the status on frequency restoration?" "Estimated 4 minutes to restore secondary grid communication. Primary grid is still functional, but overloaded. Everyone's trying to push through the same channels, and we're getting signal degradation on." "Stop pushing through primary," she said. "You're creating your own second failure." She looked up at the communications officer across the table. "Switch units 7 through 12 to manual relay protocol. Pull them off primary grid entirely. Use runners if you have to." "Runners," someone said, and there was a note of disbelief in the word. "Runners," she repeated without looking up. "Old-fashioned, reliable, impossible to jam. Units 7 through 12 go to manual relay for the next 6 minutes, while secondary grid restores. In 6 minutes, you'll have your communication back, and you won't have burned out your primary grid, trying to carry a load it wasn't designed for." She moved her finger to a different position on the display. "Now, northern approach. You pulled ground response to cover the engagement, which means this corridor," her finger traced a line, "is your actual problem, not the eastern perimeter. The eastern perimeter is already lost in the simulation. Stop trying to save it." Voss was standing to her left. He hadn't spoken since he said talk to her. He was watching the display with the expression of a man watching a chess game, where someone else is seeing 10 moves ahead and he's still catching up to move 3. "If I abandon eastern perimeter," he started. "You already lost eastern perimeter," she said not unkindly. "The units are neutralized in the simulation. You can't unlose them. What you can do is stop using resources trying to rescue a position that's gone and start protecting the position that's about to go." She looked at him directly. "The secondary support corridor. If the opposing force pushes through there in the next 8 minutes they reach your command center, that's the exercise over. He looked at the display. She watched him look at it. She watched him see it, really see it for the first time. The way the map had reorganized itself in the last 40 minutes from the plan he'd made this morning into something entirely different. Something that required a different kind of thinking, a different kind of response. "What do you need?" he said. Elena looked back at the display. "Units 4 and 9. Redirect them from Eastern Recovery to Secondary Corridor Defense. And I need someone who actually knows the communication timing on this grid, not the theoretical timing, the real timing, based on how this specific equipment has been performing this week." "That would be Specialist Torres," an officer said immediately. "She's been running the daily diagnostics." "Get her in here." Someone moved to a radio. Elena was already talking again, walking two of the logistics officers through a repositioning sequence that made the man next to Daniel Carter exhale through his teeth in something that was either relief or amazement. Daniel stood at the edge of all of it and watched. He was 29 years old, and he had been in the military for 7 years, and he had been in rooms where people managed crises before. He had seen good commanders and bad commanders and commanders who were somewhere in between. He had watched people perform under pressure and crumble under pressure and do the very specific thing that Voss had been doing for the past 14 minutes, push harder against a wall that was not going to move. What he had never seen was this. What Elena was doing was not pushing. It was the opposite of pushing. It was the thing that happened when you stopped fighting the shape of the problem and started moving with it, finding the paths that were still open, the positions that were still salvageable, the resources that had been misallocated and could be reallocated before it was too late. She was not smarter than everyone in the room. Daniel didn't think that was the right way to see it. She simply wasn't afraid of what she was looking at. And in a room full of people who were afraid of the Admiral, afraid of the failure, afraid of what it meant and who would be blamed and what would happen after that, made her the only person who could see it clearly. Specialist Torres arrived at a near run, breathless, a young woman who looked like she'd been pulled away from something important which she had. "Sir, ma'am." She stopped, uncertain of who to address. "Torres," Elena said, not looking up. "Secondary grid communication timing. The theoretical rotation window is 7 minutes. What's the actual window been this week based on your diagnostics?" Torres blinked. Then something in her posture changed the way a person's posture changes when someone asks them a question they actually know the answer to and have been waiting for someone to ask. 9 minutes and 40 seconds, she said immediately. "The equipment is running about 2 minutes 40 seconds behind optimal. I filed a maintenance report 3 weeks ago, but the check kept getting rescheduled." Elena looked at Voss. He was very still. 9 minutes and 40 seconds, Elena said quietly. "Not 7. That means the opposing force had a 2-minute 40-second window larger than your defense plan accounted for. That's not a tactical failure. That's an information failure. The person who knew the real number filed a report. The report didn't reach the plan." Voss said nothing. "Torres." Elena continued. "If we restore secondary grid communication in the next 4 minutes, can you hold the frequency stable for the remainder of the exercise?" "Yes, ma'am. If someone gets me access to reroute through the tertiary buffer." "Who has access to the tertiary buffer authorization?" "That would need to come from the communications director, Captain Marsh." 3 people in the room looked at each other in the specific way people look at each other when the answer to a simple question has just revealed a complicated problem. "Where's Captain Marsh?" Elena asked. He left the command area about 20 minutes ago. Personal reasons. He handed off to Lieutenant." "I handed off to Lieutenant Greer," said a voice from the far end of the table. A young man, barely older than Torres, raised his hand with the expression of someone who has just realized he is simultaneously more important than he thought he was, and in considerably more trouble than he expected. "That's me. Greer." "Greer," Elena said. "Do you have Marsh's authorization codes?" "No, ma'am. He didn't transfer them. He said the situation was under control, and he'd be back in Does anyone in this room have access to tertiary buffer authorization? Silence. Not the silence of people thinking, the silence of people realizing something. Voss turned to his senior aide. How is it possible? He said, his voice very quiet now, very controlled, that the officer responsible for communication contingency authorization left the command area during an active exercise without transferring his codes. The aide didn't answer. The answer was visible on his face, and the answer was that it was possible because nobody expected they would need it, because the plan was sound, because the Admiral didn't tolerate people questioning the plan, and because the culture of this command had produced over time a collection of people who were very good at following plans and very poorly equipped for the moments when the plan stopped working. Elena let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved on. We work around it, she said. Greer, what's the secondary path to communication restoration without tertiary buffer access? Greer straightened. He was scared, but he was also, Daniel noticed, the kind of young person who becomes sharper under pressure, rather than slower. Extended relay through Units 2 and 5. It adds about 90 seconds to the restoration timeline, but it doesn't require buffer authorization. Do it, Elena said. That puts restoration at... Greer was calculating rapidly, 5 minutes and 40 seconds from now. Good. Start now. She turned back to the display. We have approximately 6 minutes before the opposing force reaches secondary corridor. We need Units 4 and 9 repositioned in 4 minutes. Who's coordinating ground movement? A captain named Willard stepped forward. He was a broad, competent-looking man who had for the past 20 minutes been standing at the edge of the command tent with the frustrated expression of someone who had seen the solutions and had no authority to implement them. I can coordinate ground movement, he said. The words came out with a particular kind of energy, the energy of a man who has been watching something go wrong and has finally been given permission to help fix it. Do it, Elena said. 4 minutes. Willard was on the radio before she finished the sentence. What happened over the next 11 minutes was the thing that Daniel Carter would spend the next decade trying to explain to people who hadn't been in that room. He would struggle with it because it was not dramatic in the way military turnarounds were supposed to be dramatic. There was no single brilliant stroke, no moment of genius that reversed everything instantly. It was something quieter than that, and something more difficult than that. It was the systematic dismantling of a failure piece by piece, carried out by a room full of people who had stopped being afraid. That was the part that was hard to explain. The fear hadn't disappeared because Elena Hayes was impressive though she was. It hadn't disappeared because she outranked everyone though she did. It had disappeared, or more accurately, it had moved aside, because she was asking different questions than anyone had asked in that room before, and the questions assumed that the people she was asking them to had answers worth hearing. When she said, Torres, what's the actual window based on your diagnostics? She was not being polite. She was telling Torres without using these words that she already knew Torres had the right answer and had been unable to get anyone to listen to it, and that the listening was happening now. When she said, Greer, what's the secondary path? She was not testing him. She was telling him that his knowledge was needed and that his rank wasn't a barrier. When she said, do it to Willard, she was telling a competent officer who had been sidelined by a culture of top-down authority that his competence was the point, not his position. Daniel watched all of it, and he thought about the morning, about the way the room had laughed when Voss laughed, and about what it meant that 60 trained officers had watched the same situation Elena was looking at, and had not seen what she was seeing. They had the same information, they had the same maps, they had the same training. What they didn't have was permission to use it. At the 8-minute mark, communication with Eastern units restored. At 9 minutes, Units 4 and 9 completed repositioning. At 10 minutes and 20 seconds, when the opposing force simulation pushed into the secondary corridor, they found it defended, held by 2 repositioned units operating on restored communication with coordinated air support that had been freed up by pulling resources from the lost eastern perimeter, rather than continuing to throw good assets after bad ones. The exercise stabilized. Not perfectly. Not neatly. The eastern perimeter stayed lost, and the simulation's scoring system would reflect that. But the command center held. The primary objectives held. The catastrophic failure that had been 11 minutes ago, an absolute certainty, became something else. It became a lesson. Voss stood at his display table and watched it happen. He was a man who had spent 22 years being the most capable person in any room he walked into. He had built a career on it, a reputation on it, an identity on it. He was not a weak man or a stupid man. He was in many ways precisely the kind of officer the military system was designed to produce: decisive, confident, relentless under pressure. But in the last 15 minutes, he had watched a woman he had publicly dismissed in front of 60 witnesses do something he had not been able to do. She hadn't done it by being smarter. He had decided that already, and the decision helped. She had done it by seeing things he hadn't seen, hearing things he hadn't heard, asking questions he hadn't thought to ask of people he had trained inadvertently, systematically, not to speak unless spoken to in precisely the right way. He had built a machine. The machine was impressive. The machine ran on fear, and when the machine broke down, the fear meant that nobody would tell him the parts that were failing until the failure was too large to hide. The woman he called a brat at 8 o'clock this morning had told him the part that was failing at 8:15. He hadn't listened. He stood at his display table, and he watched the stabilized exercise play out in real time, and for the first time in 11 years of command, Admiral Richard Voss allowed himself to sit with the specific discomfort of a man confronting the distance between who he believed he was and what had just happened in his room. It was not a comfortable place to sit, but it was an honest one. Elena found Daniel Carter at the equipment staging area after the crisis phase ended, when the exercise had moved into its second scenario, and the room had redistributed itself into the functional hum of a command that was temporarily at least operating without panic. She hadn't come looking for him. She was walking between sections, making notes, checking on the communication team, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of an evaluation in progress. She happened to find him standing near the frequency array watching Torres and Greer work through the restoration protocols with the absorbed attention of someone who was learning something. She stopped beside him. He glanced at her. "Torres filed that maintenance report 3 weeks ago," he said. "I checked. It's in the system. Someone received it and deprioritized it." "Yes." "That's not a technical failure." "No," Elena said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "When I got to this base 14 months ago, I noticed a problem with the way the ground response teams were being rotated. The rotation schedule looked efficient on paper, but it left a gap in the northwest sector every third day." Elena looked at him. "I put it in my field assessment. My supervisor told me the schedule had been set by the Admiral's office and to flag it through official channels." He paused. "Official channels took 6 weeks to return a response. The response was that the schedule had been reviewed and was considered optimal." Elena was very still. "Did you follow up?" she asked. "Once," he said. "My supervisor told me it wasn't worth pushing, that it would make me look like I didn't understand how things worked around here." He looked at her sideways. "Do you know what the worst part is?" He wasn't wrong. That is how things work around here. Elena made a note. She wrote for several seconds longer than the exchange seemed to warrant, and Daniel had the impression she was writing something more complex than a simple observation. "You're writing about me," he said. "I'm writing about the system," she said. "Your evidence of the system." He thought about that. "Is that good or bad?" "It means," she said, capping her pen, "that the problem here isn't individual bad actors. It's not your supervisor. It's not even the Admiral entirely. It's what happens to a command when the culture signals consistently and over time that the cost of raising a problem is higher than the cost of staying silent." She looked at him. "Your supervisor was right that pushing would have made your career harder. That's the problem. That should never be the cost of raising a legitimate safety concern." "And how do you fix that?" Daniel asked. You start by making someone pay attention, Elena said. And sometimes the only way to do that is to let the system fail somewhere that everyone can see it. Daniel stared at her. You knew, he said slowly. You knew the exercise would fail. She looked at him steadily. I knew the conditions for failure were present. I knew no one in this command was positioned to prevent it before it happened. And you didn't prevent it. I told Admiral Voss the Eastern Line would collapse, she said, 11 minutes before the exercise started, in front of 60 officers. Daniel said nothing. I didn't prevent the failure, Elena said. I announced it. There's a difference, and the difference matters. If I had walked in here and quietly fixed the problem before it happened, what would Voss have learned? What would those 60 officers have learned? That everything runs fine. That the system is working. That there's no need to change anything. She picked up her folder. Some lessons can only be taught by letting the test happen. The second twist came not from the battlefield situation, but from inside the command tent at the 1 hour and 40-minute mark of the exercise, and it came from a direction no one expected. Captain Marsh returned. He walked through the main entrance of the command tent with the unconcerned expression of a man who had stepped out for a reasonable personal matter and expected to return to a situation that was more or less as he'd left it. What he returned to was Specialist Torres and Lieutenant Greer running the communication system with visible confidence, a command center that had stabilized from near collapse, and Elena Hayes standing at the back wall, making notes in a folder that by this point was thick with them. He stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at Torres, at Greer, at the display table where the situation bore little resemblance to what he'd left, at Elena, who he didn't recognize, but whose presence registered immediately as wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. What happened? He said to no one in particular. Admiral Voss turned from the display. Captain Marsh, he said. Something in the tone made Marsh stand up straighter. Sir, you left the command area during an active exercise. Sir, it was a personal matter I had indicated to Lieutenant Greer. You left without transferring your authorization codes. Marsh's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The situation was stable when The situation, Voss said, was not stable. The situation collapsed 11 minutes after you left, and we spent the better part of an hour operating without access to tertiary buffer authorization, because no one in this command had your codes. He paused. The communication failure we experienced today was extended by your absence. Your personnel found a workaround. They're better than the system they're working in. He held Marsh's gaze. We'll talk about this after the exercise concludes. Marsh looked at Torres and Greer. Torres was looking at her screens. Greer was focused on his relay protocol. Neither of them looked at him. Marsh sat down quietly and said nothing else, and Elena at the back wall wrote 2 lines and underlined one of them. At the 2-hour mark, the exercise concluded. The room went through the procedural wrap systems powering down simulation protocols, closing out personnel, beginning the organized dispersal of a command structure returning to baseline. Voss moved through it automatically, his hands going through the motions of shutdown procedure, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. Elena approached him from his left. Admiral, he turned. She was holding her folder closed, her pen capped. The evaluation mode was still present in her posture, but there was something different in her approach now, something slightly less formal. Not soft. She wasn't a soft person, but direct in a way that didn't require the clinical distance of the assessment phase. You made the right call, she said. In the middle of the crisis, you asked for help when you needed it. He looked at her. That shouldn't be extraordinary. No, she agreed. It shouldn't. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been doing this? Evaluations 12 years. How many commands? 31. He absorbed that. And what's the most common thing you find? She didn't hesitate. Capable soldiers being managed by fear instead of led by trust. The soldiers always know more than the commander thinks they know. The problem is never the knowledge. It's what the culture does to the knowledge before it reaches the top. He looked at the room around him. At Torres and Greer and Willard, who were talking through something at the communication bank with the easy collaboration of people who had just been through something real together. At Holloway, who was finishing a report with a slightly different posture than he'd carried this morning, more upright, more certain. Something changed today, Voss said. In this room. Yes, Elena said. It wasn't the exercise. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He looked at her. What do I do with that? He said. It was the most honest question he had asked all day, and they both knew it, and she answered it the only way it could be answered. You start tomorrow, she said, by asking Torres what else is in her maintenance report that hasn't been read yet. Torres looked up from her maintenance report the next morning and found Admiral Voss standing next to her workstation, not summoning her to his office, not sending an aide. Standing next to her workstation at 6:47 in the morning, holding 2 cups of coffee, looking like a man who had not slept well and had decided to do something about it instead of pretending he had. Show me, he said. Torres stared at him for 2 full seconds. In 14 months at Redstone Base, Admiral Richard Voss had never once visited the communications diagnostic station. Equipment maintenance was 3 levels below his daily operational concern. The people who worked here were in the organizational structure of this command, the kind of personnel whose names an admiral knew from rosters, not from conversations. She took the coffee he was offering because it seemed like the thing to do. Then she pulled up her report. What she showed him in the next 40 minutes made his jaw tighten in ways he was not entirely successful at concealing. 3 separate pieces of equipment running below optimal performance. 2 maintenance requests filed in the past 6 weeks and deprioritized without documented justification. 1 frequency irregularity that had been flagged verbally to Captain Marsh 4 days before the exercise and never entered into the system at all. Why wasn't this in the formal report? Voss asked, pointing at the frequency note. Torres chose her words carefully. Captain Marsh indicated he would handle it directly and that I should wait for his guidance before filing. And you waited? She met his eyes. Yes, sir. He understood what she wasn't saying. He understood it the same way he had understood several things yesterday slowly, and with the particular discomfort of a man rearranging the furniture of a belief he'd held for a long time. She had waited because filing over Marsh's explicit instruction would have been a career risk. Not because she was wrong. Because the system had taught her that being right at the wrong moment, through the wrong channel, in front of the wrong person, cost more than staying quiet. Voss set down his coffee. File everything, he said. All of it, backdated to the original dates you identified it. I want the full record. Sir, some of that will... She stopped. Will make certain people look bad. He finished for her. Yes. File it anyway. She nodded. She turned back to her workstation. Then she said quietly, without looking at him, Thank you, sir. He walked away without responding, but something in the set of his shoulders as he left was different from the way he'd walked in, and Torres noticed and made her own private note about it in the part of her mind she'd been keeping notes in for 14 months. Elena was watching from the far end of the room. She always arrived before anyone expected her to. The formal debrief was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the main briefing room, and by 8:45, every officer who had been in the command tent yesterday was present and seated and contributing to a silence that had the specific texture of a room full of people who knew something important was about to happen and were managing their anxiety about it in a variety of personal ways. Willard was reviewing notes. Greer was absolutely still, hands flat on the table, the posture of a young officer who has learned that stillness reads as composure even when it isn't. Marsh sat at the far end, with the expression of a man attending his own trial and trying to appear relaxed about it. Holloway had chosen a seat near the door which said something about his current relationship with the concept of exits. Daniel Carter sat in the middle of the room and watched Elena organize her folder at the front table. She had the kind of presence in a room that didn't require noise. She wasn't performing authority. She simply occupied the space she was standing in with complete conviction, and the room organized itself around that conviction without being asked to. Voss entered at 8:58. Everyone stood. "Sit down," he said, and took his seat at the head of the table. He looked at Elena. She looked back. "Colonel Hayes," he said, "the floor is yours." She did not begin with the failures. That was the first thing that surprised the room. Everyone had been braced for it. The accounting, the list of what went wrong, the formal documentation of the exercise's collapse, read back in clinical language that made it impossible to minimize or reframe. That was how these evaluations went. That was how everyone understood them to work. Instead, Elena opened her folder and said, "Tell me what went right." Silence. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say. The silence of people who had not been asked that question and were rapidly recalibrating. "The runner relay," Greer said, finally his voice careful testing whether this was a trap. "When we lost secondary grid, the manual relay held. It slowed us down, but it didn't break." "Yes," Elena said. "Why did it hold?" "Because Torres had run the manual relay protocol in the monthly drills even after it was removed from the standard exercise rotation. She kept running it because she thought we might need it." Elena looked at Torres. "I didn't have authorization to reinstate it in the rotation," Torres said. "So I just ran it anyway, during the drill windows. I told people it was a variance test." "You falsified a drill classification to run a protocol you believed we needed," Elena said. Torres's expression went carefully neutral. "Yes, ma'am. That's the reason the secondary relay worked yesterday when nothing else did," Elena said. "You're not in trouble, Specialist. I want you to understand that. You're the reason this exercise had any recoverable outcome at all. But I need you to hear what that means. It means that the only thing standing between this command and a complete communication failure was one person quietly doing the right thing in secret, in defiance of the authorized protocol, because the authorized protocol was wrong and she knew it and couldn't get anyone to listen." The room was very still. "That," Elena said, "is the problem." She let it sit there for a moment. Let the room feel the weight of it, not as accusation, but as diagnosis. The difference mattered. Accusation made people defensive. Diagnosis made people think. "Not one person in this room did anything wrong because they were malicious," she continued. "Marsh deprioritized a maintenance report because the schedule pressure from above told him to prioritize operational readiness metrics, and a maintenance delay doesn't show up on a readiness metric until it causes a failure. Torres ran her unauthorized drills because she cared about her team and had no other way to protect them. Greer took on an authorization role without the codes because there was no one else." She looked around the table slowly. Every individual decision made sense inside the system that produced it. The system is what doesn't make sense. "Then what do we change?" Voss said. It was the same directness as last night, and it surprised the room the same way. Voss asking what instead of defending why. Voss treating the evaluation as information rather than attack. Several officers shifted in their seats with the subtle physical adjustment of people updating an internal model. "Three things," Elena said. "First, information flow. Right now, information in this command moves upward only when it's positive or when it's too large a failure to hide. Everything in between disappears. Maintenance concerns protocol questions, field observations from junior personnel. All of it gets filtered out before it reaches command level. You're making decisions with 30% of the available data." "How do you fix that?" Willard asked. "You start by asking," Elena said. "Not through formal channels, not through reports. You walk to Torres's workstation at 6:47 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee, and you ask her to show you what's in her maintenance log." She glanced briefly at Voss. "That already happened today. It's a start." Several pairs of eyes moved to Voss. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. "Second," Elena continued, "authorization structures. This command has created a system where too much critical decision-making authority is concentrated in too few people. When Marsh walked out of the command area, he took the tertiary buffer codes with him, and there was no protocol for distributing that authority in his absence. That's not Marsh's personal failing. That's a structural gap. She made a note. We need redundant authorization pathways for every critical system, not as an insult to the officers who currently hold those authorizations, as a recognition that people are human and humans leave rooms. Marsh, at the far end of the table, had the expression of a man who had expected much worse and was slowly recalibrating towards something that felt almost like relief. Third, Elena said, and here her voice shifted slightly. Not louder, but with a different quality. The quality of something that matters more than the items before it. Accountability without punishment for raising concerns. Right now, this command punishes failure and ignores silence. The result is people who choose silence. You need a system that rewards raising concerns even when those concerns turn out to be wrong, because the cost of discouraging concern raising is not that you avoid unnecessary reports. It's that you lose Torres's maintenance flags and Greer's protocol instincts and Carter's Northwest Sector rotation observation. The last name hit the room differently than the others. Daniel felt it before he understood it. He felt eyes moving toward him. He felt the change in the room's temperature, the specific thermal shift of collective attention. Carter, Voss said, and his voice was carefully neutral. Daniel did not look away. Sir? Northwest Sector rotation, Voss said. You filed an observation 14 months ago. Yes, sir. And it was returned as reviewed and optimal. Yes, sir. Voss looked at Elena. She was looking at her folder. The Northwest Sector rotation gap was identified in an independent operational review conducted by my office 8 months ago, she said. The recommendation to adjust the rotation was filed with Regional Command in month 9. Implementation was approved in month 11. She looked up. The adjusted rotation takes effect next quarter. Daniel stared at her. Your office reviewed it, he said slowly. Yes. 8 months ago. Yes. After I filed my observation. Your observation was one of 4 field-level reports that informed the independent review, Elena said. You were right. The gap existed. The correction is coming. She looked at him steadily. It took 14 months from your initial report to implementation approval, which is 11 months longer than it should have taken. That's what I'm here to change. The room absorbed this. Daniel Carter, who had spent 14 months being quietly certain he was right and quietly uncertain, it mattered, sat in his chair and felt something shift in his chest that he could not have accurately named, but that felt something like the specific relief of being seen after a long time of being invisible. The first major twist of the morning came 40 minutes into the debrief, and it came from the direction no one had thought to watch. One of the senior tactical officers, Colonel Bernard Hatch, had been silent for the entire session. He was a heavy-set man with 30 years of service, the kind of officer who wore his experience visibly, not as arrogance exactly, but as the settled certainty of someone who has seen enough that new information rarely surprises him. He had not, unlike most of the room, been visibly processing Elena's points. He had been watching her, specifically, with an attention that was not the attention of a man taking notes. He raised his hand. "Colonel Hayes," he said. Elena looked at him. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. "Go ahead. This evaluation, this entire exercise..." He paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who has decided to say something and wants to say it precisely. How much of what happened yesterday was designed? The room went very quiet. "Elaborate," Elena said. "The failure," Hatch said. "The Eastern Line. The communication rotation gap. The timing." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been in this command for 3 years. I've run maintenance protocols and exercise drills and field assessments. The conditions for yesterday's failure didn't appear last week. They've been building for a long time. He looked at her without blinking. I want to know if your office knew about them before you arrived. If this evaluation was designed to produce a failure so that the lesson would be visible. The silence in the room was the loudest Elena had heard since the exercise. She looked at Hatch for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Yes." Half the room stopped breathing. My office identified the systemic conditions at Redstone 6 months ago through regional performance data, Elena said. The maintenance gaps, the communication protocol irregularities, the cultural patterns around information suppression. We identified them remotely from data. When General Whitmore authorized this evaluation, the decision was made to conduct it as an unannounced observational assessment during an active exercise, not to manufacture failure. But because the conditions for failure were already present, and an exercise was the most controlled environment in which to let those conditions produce their natural outcome while minimizing risk to actual personnel. You let us fail on purpose, said a voice from the middle of the table. The conditions of this command let you fail, Elena said. I observed it. That's a distinction without a difference, Hatch said. It's the most important distinction there is, Elena said, and her voice had an edge now, not anger, but precision. The precision of someone who has thought about this for a very long time. If I had come into this command and told you without evidence, without demonstration, without 5,000 witnesses, that your culture was producing dangerous information gaps, what would have happened? Nobody answered. Admiral Voss, she said. He looked at her. If I had come to you 6 months ago with a report that said your command culture was producing communication failures, what would you have done? He was quiet for a moment, an honest moment. The room could see him being honest, and it was not a comfortable thing to watch. I would have thanked you for the report, he said, and told you my command was running well. Yes, Elena said. You would have, because 6 months ago nothing had failed yet. Nothing had failed that you could see. And in a command where fear filters information upward, the Admiral is always the last person to know something is breaking. She looked at Hatch. I did not manufacture a lesson. I created the conditions under which the lesson that already existed could be seen by everyone in this room, including the person who needed to see it most. Hatch held her gaze for a long moment. He was not entirely satisfied. Elena could see that. He was a 30-year man with a 30-year man's complicated relationship with the idea that the system that had made him had also perhaps failed him in ways he was only beginning to catalog. All right, he said finally. Not agreement. Acceptance. There was a difference, and she respected it. The second major twist came from outside the room. At 11:23, the debrief was interrupted by Voss's aide, who opened the door with an expression that communicated urgency without saying a word, and leaned in to whisper something in the Admiral's ear. Voss's expression changed, not dramatically. He was too experienced for dramatic expressions. But the people in that room knew his face, and they saw what moved across it, something that was not quite surprise and not quite concern, but occupied the territory between them. He looked at Elena. General Whitmore is here, he said. The room moved in the subtle collective way rooms move when a name arrives that rearranges the hierarchy. Backs straightened, attention sharpened. Several officers looked at the door. He wasn't scheduled to arrive until tomorrow, Elena said. No. Voss agreed. He wasn't. There was a beat of something between them, a half-second of shared uncertainty. That was, Elena realized, the first moment of genuine equality between her and Richard Voss, two people who were both momentarily looking at something they hadn't anticipated. He must have seen the exercise data, Elena said. He gets the feed in real time, Voss said. He's been watching since it started. Daniel Carter, listening from his chair in the middle of the room, thought he watched the whole thing. He watched Voss call her a brat. He watched the Eastern line collapse. He watched Elena take over the display table. He watched all of it in real time from wherever he was, and then he got in a vehicle and drove to Redstone Base. The question was why. He wasn't the only one asking it. The question was in the room like a physical presence, taking up the space that the debrief had just vacated. "Should we?" Willard started. "We wait," Voss said. They waited. The door opened 2 minutes later. General Marcus Whitmore walked into the briefing room with 2 aides and the particular quality of stillness that very powerful people sometimes carry. The stillness of someone who is never in a hurry, because they don't need to be, because the world waits for them, rather than the reverse. He was in his mid-60s, lean with a face that had been shaped by decades of making decisions under pressure into something that communicated very little unless he chose to let it communicate something. Everyone in the room stood. "Sit down," he said. He did not go to the head of the table. He walked to the side, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the room the way Elena had looked at the tactical display, not at one point, at everything. Then he looked at Elena. "Colonel Hayes," he said. "General? I watched the exercise yesterday." "I know, sir." "All of it?" "Yes, sir." He turned to Voss. "Admiral." "General Whitmore," Voss said. His voice was controlled, but Daniel, watching, could see the effort behind the control. "I've read Colonel Hayes's preliminary field notes," Whitmore said. He paused. "They're thorough." "Sir, I'm not here to relitigate yesterday," Whitmore said. "I'm here because there's a decision that needs to be made, and I want to make it in this room in front of the people who were in that command tent." He looked around the table. What happened at this base yesterday is going to become a training case. Colonel Hayes's evaluation, including the exercise failure and the recovery, is going to be incorporated into the regional command leadership curriculum. He let that land. Every command in this region is going to learn from what happened here. The room digested this. Marsh looked at the table. Hatch looked at Whitmore. Torres at the far end had an expression that was carefully blank in the way a person's expression is blank when they are experiencing an emotion too large for the setting. "The second thing," Whitmore said. "Admiral Voss." Voss met his eyes. "You have 30 days of mandatory command review," Whitmore said. "During that period, Colonel Hayes will remain at Redstone to implement the structural changes identified in the evaluation. You will remain in your post, but all command decisions above operational level will require joint sign-off." The room was absolutely silent. "This is not a punishment," Whitmore said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who meant it. "This is a correction. You are a good officer, Richard. You've been commanding this base for 6 years and your record is strong. What happened yesterday happened because a culture grew up around your command style that you weren't aware of, and that is fixable. We are fixing it." He paused. "The alternative is to remove you from command. I have chosen not to do that. I expect you to understand why." Voss said, "Yes, sir." "Good." Whitmore looked at Elena. "Colonel Hayes has 30 days. She has my full authorization, whatever she needs." He looked around the room one final time. This command failed yesterday in a controlled environment. That's the best possible place to fail. What you do with it from here is what matters. He straightened. "That's all." He walked out. The aides followed. The door closed. The room was silent for 5 full seconds. Then Voss looked at Elena. 30 days, he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. Not enthusiasm, she didn't expect enthusiasm. But something real. Something that was, if not acceptance, at least the genuine beginning of it. "Then we'd better get started," he said. What Elena started that afternoon was not dramatic. It was in fact the opposite of dramatic, which was part of why it worked. She didn't hold town halls. She didn't post new policy documents. She didn't call command-wide meetings where she outlined the changes and invited questions. She walked around the base and talked to people, one at a time in the spaces where they actually worked. She visited the communications diagnostic station and talked to Torres. She found Greer running a relay protocol and stood next to him for 20 minutes asking questions. She sat with Willard in the ground operations unit and went through his field coordination logs from the past 6 months, asking him to explain his thinking at each decision point, not to second-guess him, but to understand what information he'd had and what information he'd been missing. She visited the Northwest Sector rotation team and told 3 junior soldiers directly and simply that their field observations from the past year had contributed to a policy correction at the regional level. She watched their faces when she said it, and filed what she saw in the private record she kept of human moments that mattered. Daniel Carter found her in the vehicle bay at 4 in the afternoon, talking to a mechanic named Ruiz, who had been at Redstone for 9 years, and who had discovered the most comprehensive unofficial knowledge base about the base's equipment history of anyone on the installation. He watched her for a few minutes from a distance, watched her ask questions, watched Ruiz answer them with increasing animation, the animation of a person who has been waiting a long time to be asked and had stopped expecting it. She was not, Daniel thought, transforming the command by redesigning its structure, though the structure would be redesigned. She was transforming it by doing repeatedly and visibly the thing the command's culture had made impossible. She was treating people's knowledge as valuable, regardless of their rank, and she was doing it in front of enough people that it was beginning to look not like an exception, but like a norm. He understood then what she had meant about lessons, about how some things could only be learned by demonstration, not declaration. About how a culture changed, not when someone announced that it had changed, but when the people inside it started to feel a different set of rules operating around them. She found him watching and walked over. Ruiz has been here 9 years, she said. He knows which vehicle systems are running on workarounds versus proper parts, and has been keeping informal records of it since year 3. Nobody has ever asked him about it. What do you do with that? I document it, she said. I submit it as part of the evaluation finding, and I recommend that a formal equipment knowledge repository be established with a direct input pathway for maintenance personnel. She paused. Then in 6 months, someone like Ruiz has a legitimate channel instead of a personal notebook. Daniel looked at her. You're building systems. That's what this is, she said. Not inspiration, not speeches, systems. The right people with the right information at the right time, with pathways that don't require someone to be brave to use them. He thought about that. When you leave, he said, in 30 days, what happens if it all slides back? She looked at him for a long moment. That, she said, is exactly the right question, and the honest answer is that some of it might. Culture is slow. Structure is faster, but it's not instant. She looked back toward the vehicle bay, where Ruiz was now showing someone else his informal records, with the enthusiasm of a man who has recently discovered that his informal records are evidence. The structural changes will hold better than the cultural ones. The cultural ones depend on whether the people in this command keep practicing the new behavior long enough for it to become the default. She paused. It also depends on whether the people who watched what happened yesterday and who understand what it meant stay in this command long enough to model the behavior for the people who come after them. Madam. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said it directly, but it was there between them, clear as anything Elena Hayes had ever said at a display table in the middle of a collapsing exercise. She was talking about him. And he knew it. And somewhere in his chest, in the same place where 14 months of quiet certainty had lived alongside 14 months of quiet doubt, something that had been waiting a long time finally made a decision. The first week was the hardest. Not because of resistance exactly. Resistance would have been easier to work with. Resistance had a shape you could push against an argument, you could answer a wall, you could find your way around. What Elena found in the first 7 days at Redstone was something more complicated than resistance. She found habit. 22 years of Richard Voss running his command a specific way had produced 22 years of people learning how to exist inside that way. They weren't fighting the change. They were simply continuing to do what they had always done, because what you have always done does not feel like a choice. It feels like the floor beneath your feet. You don't think about whether to stand on it. You just stand on it because that's where the floor is. On day 2, Greer filed a communication anomaly report through official channels. It took 3 days to return to him, marked as reviewed. By the time it came back, the anomaly had corrected itself, which was the best possible outcome and also the worst possible lesson. On day 3, a junior logistics officer named Petty approached his direct supervisor with a concern about fuel allocation ratios during the second phase training rotation. His supervisor told him to document it and send it up the chain. He documented it. He sent it up the chain. It landed in an inbox that was checked every Thursday. The training rotation ran on Tuesday. The concern was, by Thursday, irrelevant. Elena documented both of these things without expression and without immediate intervention. She was watching the system reveal itself in real time, which was not comfortable but was necessary, because you could not fix the parts of a machine you hadn't seen move yet. On day 4, she went back to Voss. He was at his desk when she knocked. He waved her in with the gesture of a man who had been expecting her and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or braced. "Greer's anomaly report," she said, and set the paper on his desk. He read it. He looked up. It was returned marked reviewed in 3 days. Yes. By someone in the 3rd administrative tier who had no technical background to evaluate it, and marked it reviewed because that's what happens when a report enters the official channel without a clear escalation pathway. It gets processed, not considered. She sat down across from him. 3 days from flag to return. The anomaly resolved itself in 2. If it hadn't resolved itself, we would have discovered the problem on Thursday after the training rotation failed on Tuesday. Voss was quiet. "What is the fix?" he said. "2 things, Elena said. First, technical reports from communications and equipment personnel need a direct escalation pathway to the relevant department head within 4 hours, not the standard chain. Second," she paused, "someone needs to call Greer right now and tell him his report was read and that the question he raised was valid, even though the anomaly self-corrected." Voss frowned. "We need to call a lieutenant to tell him his report was valid." "We need to call a lieutenant," Elena said, "because he filed that report 2 days after watching the entire command nearly collapse, because nobody filed reports. And if the first report he files after that experience disappears into the system for 3 days and comes back marked, reviewed with no follow-up, he will draw the obvious conclusion and file fewer reports in the future." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Greer directly. Elena did not stay to listen. She walked out of the office and let the door close behind her, and she stood in the corridor for a moment with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a very large thing move slowly in the right direction. Wow. By the end of the first week, 3 things had changed at Redstone that anyone paying attention could measure. Torres's maintenance reports were being read within 24 hours. Ruiz's informal equipment records had been formally requested by the base logistics coordinator, a man named Chambers, who had initially resisted the idea with the specific resistance of a person defending territory, and then upon actually reading the records, had gone quiet for a day and come back saying he needed to reschedule the next 4 maintenance cycles. And Voss was walking around. This was the thing that the personnel at Redstone noticed before anything else, before the new reporting pathway, or the revised authorization protocols, or the equipment knowledge repository that Torres and Ruiz were building together in a shared file that they had taken to updating every morning with a dedication that Elena found privately deeply moving. What they noticed was that Admiral Voss was no longer conducting his command exclusively from the command center. He was moving through the base, talking to people. Not inspecting them. Inspecting had a specific posture, and everyone recognized it. This was different. This was the posture of someone learning the base they thought they already knew. On day 5, he spent 45 minutes in the vehicle bay with Ruiz. On day 6, he sat in on a communications diagnostic session with Torres and Greer and asked at one point a question about frequency rotation mechanics that was, and Torres mentioned this to Daniel Carter afterward, with an expression that occupied the unusual territory between amusement and genuine respect. Actually, a good question. On day 7, he called a meeting of his senior staff and told them without performance or ceremony that the reporting culture of this command was changing and that anyone who felt they had contributed to the previous culture by suppressing or deprioritizing concerns from junior personnel should consider that acknowledgement sufficient and move forward. He did not name names. He did not assign blame. He simply said it clearly and directly, and then he said that the first person who retaliated against a junior officer for raising a legitimate concern would be removed from their position. He said it once. He didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. Elena found Daniel Carter on day 8, standing outside the Northwest Sector rotation point at 6 in the morning, which was not his assigned location at that hour. He was watching the rotation changeover with the focused attention of someone checking whether the thing they had predicted was true. She stood next to him. "Adjusted rotation takes effect next quarter," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not watching for the problem. I'm watching the people who run it." He paused. "The 3 soldiers who do this rotation, none of them know about the gap. Nobody ever told them. They've been running a rotation with a structural vulnerability for 14 months, and nobody thought to say, 'Hey, this has a problem. Here's what to watch for in the meantime.'" Elena looked at him. "So tell them," she said. He turned to look at her. "I'm a lieutenant." "Yes," she said. "And you identified this 14 months ago, and you have been right about it the entire time. Tell them." He was quiet for a moment. "Will that," he started. "Will it be received well?" she said. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe the rotation supervisor will feel undermined. Maybe he'll appreciate it. Maybe he'll check with his chain of command first. What I know is that 3 soldiers are running a vulnerable rotation without knowing it's vulnerable, and you know it's vulnerable. And the only thing standing between your knowledge and their safety is a calculation about how it might be received." She looked at him. "Make the call, Lieutenant." He stood there for another moment. Then, he walked toward the rotation point. Elena watched him go. She watched him approach the rotation supervisor, a sergeant named Okafor, and she watched the body language of the initial contact. Okafor slightly defensive. Carter, careful, both of them working through the social physics of a junior officer, raising a concern with someone in a parallel lane. She watched Okafor's expression change not all at once, but in stages, as Carter explained what he had observed 14 months ago, and what he knew about the correction coming next quarter, and what he thought the team should be watching for in the interim. She watched Okafor call the other 2 soldiers over. She watched all 4 of them look at the rotation point together. She watched Okafor ask a question, and Carter answer it, and one of the other soldiers ask a follow-up question that Carter didn't have the answer to, but said he'd find out. She turned away before it finished. She had seen enough. The first major twist of Week 2 came from the direction Elena had been anticipating since day 1, and had not yet had to confront directly. Colonel Bernard Hatch requested a private meeting. He came to the small office Elena had been using as her base of operations, a spare room off the main administrative corridor, functional and unremarkable, which she had made no attempt to personalize, because she had learned a long time ago that personalizing temporary spaces was a way of making yourself comfortable inside situations that were not supposed to be comfortable. She worked better, slightly uncomfortable. She thought more clearly. She noticed more. Hatch sat down across from her with the deliberate care of a large man in a small chair and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the debrief. Not with hostility, with the particular alertness of someone who has decided that the normal social lubricants of a meeting are not worth the time they take. "I want to talk about the training case," he said. "All right," she said. "Right. Whitmore said yesterday's exercise is going to become a training case for the regional command curriculum." He paused. "Who is named in it?" Elena looked at him steadily. "The exercise is documented as a systemic evaluation. Individual officers are referenced by role, not name, in the primary curriculum materials. And the supplementary materials." She didn't answer immediately. "Hatch," she said. "What are you asking me?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm asking whether Admiral Voss's name appears in the detailed case file." "Why?" "Because I've served under Richard Voss for 3 years, he said. "And I'm asking you to tell me honestly whether what you put in that file is fair." The room sat with that for a moment. Elena set down her pen. She did this rarely enough that it meant something. "Yes," she said. "His name appears, in context, with full documentation of what happened before, during, and after the exercise, including his decision to ask for help when he needed it, and his actions in the days following." She held Hatch's gaze. "The file is not a prosecution. It's a record. And the record includes the part where he walked to Torres's workstation at 6:47 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and asked her to show him what she'd been trying to tell him for 6 weeks. Hatch absorbed this. "He's a good officer," Hatch said. Not defensively, as a statement of fact that he needed to put in the room. "I know," Elena said. "The file reflects that. The file also reflects that good officers can build bad cultures without knowing they're doing it, and that this command came within 11 minutes of a simulated catastrophe because of a culture that one good officer built over 22 years. She looked at him. "Those 2 things are both true, and they need to be both true in the file because the lesson is only useful if it's accurate." Hatch was quiet for a long time. "There are people in this command," he said finally, "who are going to look at what happened and see it as evidence that Voss should be replaced. Not Whitmore. Whitmore has already made his decision, and he's a fair man. But people further up, or people with agendas who will use this case to make an argument." "Yes," Elena said. "There probably are." "Does that concern you?" "My job is to document accurately and recommend specifically," Elena said. "What people do with accurate documentation is outside my control. What I can control is whether the documentation is accurate." She paused. "I have been doing this for 12 years, Colonel. 31 commands. I have written evaluation cases that were used fairly and cases that were used as weapons. I can't prevent the latter. I can only make sure the former is available to anyone who chooses to use it." Hatch looked at her for another long moment. "All right," he said. He stood up. He was almost at the door when he stopped, and Elena had the impression of a man who had prepared something and almost chosen not to say it, and at the last moment decided to say it anyway. "The debrief," he said without turning around. "When you told the room that what happened was designed, that your office knew the conditions for failure were already present." He paused. "That was the most honest thing I've heard in a briefing room in a long time." He walked out. Elena sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The second week brought its own texture of change, different from the first week, in the way the second week of anything difficult is different. The initial momentum has settled into the harder, less visible work of doing the same things again that you did last week, without the novelty to carry you, without the crisis to justify the urgency, with only the slow accumulation of small, correct decisions to prove that anything is actually moving. Torres's shared file with Ruiz was now 37 pages. Chambers, the logistics coordinator, who had initially resisted it, was contributing entries. He had apparently been keeping his own informal records for 6 years and had never had a place to put them. Greer had filed 3 more reports. 2 had been responded to within 4 hours. The third had taken 11 hours because the relevant department head had been in the field, and when Greer received it, he sent back a 1-line acknowledgement that was probably the most professionally worded expression of mild frustration Elena had ever read, and she made a note to address the field coverage protocol for the 4-hour response window. Marsh, who had been quieter than usual since Whitmore's visit, came to Elena's office on day 11. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He sat down without being invited, to which she registered as progress from the man who had returned to the command tent after the exercise with the unconcerned expression of someone who expected to find everything exactly as he'd left it. "I want to talk about the authorization codes," he said. "I'm listening," she said. "The new protocol requires dual-holder authorization for all critical system codes. My codes are now shared with Greer as secondary holder." He paused. "I understand why. I'm not disputing it. I want to talk about how it's implemented." "What's your concern?" "Greer is sharp," Marsh said. "He handled the relay correctly during the exercise, better than most people would have. But dual-holder authorization only works if both holders have equal situational awareness about when to use the authorization and how. Right now, Greer has the codes and a written protocol document. He paused again. He doesn't have 12 years of context for why certain decisions are made the way they are, and that matters. Elena looked at him. What are you proposing? A structured handoff, he said. Not just the codes, the knowledge. Formal sessions 2 hours a week, him and me going through the history of this system, the decisions that shaped how it's currently configured, the situations where the standard protocol needs judgment. He straightened slightly. I want to build him into the role properly, not just hand him an authorization code and a document. Elena set down her pen for the second time in 2 days. Write up a session plan, she said. Submit it to me by end of week. I'll incorporate it into the structural recommendations. He nodded. He stood. He was at the door. Marsh, she said. He turned. This is the right thing, she said. Not warmly, she wasn't performing warmth she didn't feel, but directly, which was what he needed. What you're proposing is exactly the kind of knowledge transfer this command should have been doing for years. It's good. He nodded once. Something moving briefly across his face that was not quite relief and not quite pride, but lived in the general neighborhood of both. I should have transferred the codes during the exercise, he said. I knew I'd be gone for more than 10 minutes. I told myself the situation was stable enough. I told myself it would be fine. Yes, Elena said. It almost wasn't. No, she said. It almost wasn't. He nodded again and left. And Elena sat in the silence of the room for a moment with the specific weight of a day that had contained more human honesty than she usually encountered in a week. On day 14, Voss called her in. She had been expecting it. Not because anything had gone wrong, in fact the opposite. She had been expecting it because of the particular quality of his patience in the past few days, the patience of a man working up to something he wasn't entirely sure how to say. She sat across from him. He had her preliminary report on his desk. He had clearly read it, she could tell by the way it was positioned, slightly angled with the specific marks of a document that has been picked up and put down several times. The culture section, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You write that the command culture at Redstone was shaped over time by a leadership style that prioritized decisive confidence over collaborative inquiry, and that this created an environment where the cost of raising concerns outweighed the perceived benefit. He looked up. Is that a fair characterization? Yes, Elena said. Of my leadership style. Of the culture that developed around your leadership style, she said. Which is related, but not identical. He absorbed the distinction. What's the difference? The difference, she said, is that the culture is partly yours and partly the natural tendency of organizations to amplify whatever the person at the top rewards and punishes. You rewarded decisive confidence and punished uncertainty. You didn't design that policy consciously. You simply operated the way you had always operated, and over 22 years the people around you learned to reflect it back to you. She paused. The culture belongs to you the way a shadow belongs to a person. It's yours, but it also has its own shape, and that shape extends further than you intended. He looked at her for a long moment. You could have written this less charitably, he said. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She looked at him. Because you walked to Torres's workstation at 6:47 in the morning. Because you called Greer directly. Because you told your senior staff that the first person who retaliated against a junior officer, raising a legitimate concern, would be removed from their position, and you said it once, and trusted the room to hear it. She paused. Because in the middle of a crisis in front of 60 witnesses, you said, Colonel Hayes, do you have a recommendation? And you meant it. She held his gaze. I document what I see, Admiral. All of it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I owe Torres an apology. Elena looked at him. Not for yesterday, he said. For the 6 weeks before it. For the maintenance report that sat in the system because the culture told her it wasn't worth pushing. For the 9 minutes and 40 seconds nobody knew about until everything broke. He paused. She filed the report. She ran the unauthorized drills. She built the relay protocol into her team's muscle memory without being asked, without authorization, because she was trying to protect people, and nobody was giving her a legitimate way to do it. He shook his head slowly. That's not dedication. That's a person working around a system that failed her. Yes, Elena said. I want to fix that. I know, she said. He looked at her. How do I tell her that? Elena considered this for a moment. The same way you told her to file everything, she said. You go to her workstation. You don't make it a ceremony. You just tell her. He nodded. He went that afternoon. Daniel Carter saw him go and watched him come back 20 minutes later with an expression that was quieter than anything Daniel had seen on that face before. Not diminished, not defeated, but somehow more solid than before, the way things are more solid after they have been tested and have not broken. The twist that nobody had been expecting came on day 17, and it didn't come from inside Redstone Base. It came from a phone call. Elena was in her office at 7 in the evening, working through the structural recommendation document that was due to General Whitmore's office at the end of week 3 when her phone rang. She looked at the number. Something moved across her face that Daniel, who happened to be walking past in the corridor and could see her through the open door, had not seen before. Something that was not, he realized, entirely professional. She answered. She listened for 30 seconds. She said, "When?" She listened again. She said, "I understand. I'll be available," and hung up. She sat still for a moment. Daniel knocked on the open door. She looked up. Whatever had moved across her face was gone now, controlled back into the professional composure that he had come to recognize as her default state. But he had seen it. And because he had been watching her for 17 days, with the specific attention of someone who was learning something from watching, he knew that what he had seen was not the composure. "Everything all right?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. Then she made a decision he could see her making. "Sit down, Lieutenant," she said. He sat. "There's a second evaluation," she said, "running parallel to this one, different base, different command, same regional curriculum, same systemic issues identified from performance data 6 months ago." She paused. "The evaluating officer is a colleague of mine. He's been at that base for 12 days. Daniel waited. "He's been removed from the base," she said. "Temporarily. Pending a formal complaint from the base commander about the conduct of the evaluation." Daniel stared at her. "Removed." The complaint alleges that the evaluation was conducted in bad faith, that the evaluating officer deliberately provoked a command failure to manufacture evidence for a predetermined conclusion. She paused. "The language in the complaint is almost identical to what Hatch said to me in the debrief on day 2. That what happened here was designed," Daniel said. "Yes. He thought about that. Hatch said it to you, and you answered him honestly." "Yes." "This other commander filed a formal complaint." "Yes." "Why the difference?" Elena looked at him. It was a real question, and she gave it a real answer. "Because Hatch is a 30-year officer who has seen enough to know that the honest question deserves an honest answer, and that arguing about it wouldn't change what happened. He's also," she said, "a man who serves under someone who, when confronted with a crisis he couldn't control, asked for help instead of doubling down." She paused. "The other base commander did not ask for help. He filed a complaint." Daniel absorbed this. "What happens now?" "General Whitmore's office reviews the complaint. My colleague remains available but off base. The evaluation is suspended pending review." She picked up her pen. "If the review finds merit in the complaint, the evaluation is classified as conducted in bad faith and the findings are inadmissible. And if there's no merit, the evaluation resumes. The complaint goes into the commander's file." She paused. "And my evaluation here, this one, everything we've built in 17 days becomes significantly more important. Because if one regional evaluation is challenged and overturned, the scrutiny on all of them increases, including this one." Daniel was very still. "They could challenge this evaluation," he said. "Yes," Elena said. Someone could make the same argument. That I arrived here with a predetermined conclusion, that I provoked the exercise failure, that the evaluation should be inadmissible. She looked at him steadily. Which is why the documentation here needs to be airtight. Which is why the changes at this base need to be real and measurable and witnessed by enough people that they can't be characterized as performance. She set down her pen. And which is why what happens here in the next 13 days matters more than I told you it was going to when we started. He looked at her. Tell me what you need, he said. She looked back at him, and something shifted in her expression, not softening, because she was not a person who softened, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when someone on the other side finally knocks. I need witnesses, she said. Not testimony, not reports. I need people who were in that command tent 12 days ago, and who can say credibly and specifically that the changes they have watched happen since then are real. That Torres's file is real. That Ruiz's equipment records are real. That Voss walked to the workstation himself. She paused. I need the truth of this place to be visible enough that it can't be questioned. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we'd better make sure people know what they saw, he said. He stood up. And then he did something that Elena Hayes in 12 years and 31 commands had not seen a junior officer do unprompted, without being asked in the middle of a situation that was still uncertain. He said, I'll talk to Torres and Greer tonight, and Willard, and Okafor from the Northwest Rotation Point, and Ruiz. He paused at the door. They all saw it. They all saw exactly what happened, and what changed. They'll say so if someone asks them. He paused again. And if nobody asks them, I'll make sure someone does. Elena looked at him for a long moment. 14 months ago, she said, you identified a structural gap in the Northwest rotation and put it in a field assessment. Nobody listened. Yes, he said. Today you're organizing the witnesses to protect an evaluation that might determine whether real change at this base holds or gets reversed. He looked at her. Same instinct, he said simply. Different day. He walked out. Elena sat in the silence of her temporary office, in a room she had not personalized, because she never did, and looked at the door he had just walked through. Then she picked up her pen and added one more line to the document on her desk. Daniel moved fast. Not running, he had learned enough from watching Elena to know that urgency performed loudly was urgency wasted. He moved with the particular speed of someone who has identified the right thing to do and intends to do it before anything can interrupt the decision. He went to Torres first because Torres was still in the communications diagnostic station at 7:15 in the evening, which told him everything he needed to know about how seriously she took her work now that someone was finally taking it seriously back. She looked up when he came in. She read his face before he said a word. What happened? She said. He told her. Not all of it. Not the details that weren't his to share, but enough. Another evaluation, another base, a formal complaint. The possibility that what was built here could be questioned, challenged, picked apart by people who had not been in this room for 17 days and had not seen what changed. Torres listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. She stayed calm the whole time, Torres said. Even when nobody in this room believed she was who she said she was. Even when the Admiral, she stopped. What do you need from me? Specifics, Daniel said. Dates times what you filed when it was responded to what changed after the exercise and what changed before. Not a formal statement that'll come from Whitmore's office if it needs to. But be ready. Know what you saw and when you saw it. Torres almost smiled. Lieutenant, I've been keeping dated records of everything that happened in this diagnostic station for 14 months. I have the maintenance report I filed 6 weeks ago. I have the timestamp of when it was returned as deprioritized. I have the timestamp of when Admiral Voss called me the morning after the exercise. I have the session notes from every communication restoration drill I ran without authorization. She paused. I was keeping those records because I thought someday someone would need them. I just didn't know it would be to defend the person who finally listened." Daniel looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Go talk to Greer," she said, already turning back to her station. "He's in the relay room. He'll want to know." Greer took it differently than Torres. He was 24 years old, and he had been in the military for 3 years, and the exercise had been, by his own private reckoning, the most frightening and most clarifying experience of his professional life. Frightening because he had held an authorization role he wasn't equipped for in the middle of a real failure. Clarifying because he had done it anyway, and it had worked, and the woman who had put him in that position had known it would work before he knew it himself. When Daniel told him what was happening, Greer went very still. "They could reverse everything," he said. "If the complaint holds, it creates pressure on evaluations across the region, including this one. But the changes here are real." His voice had an edge. "Torres's file is real. The new reporting pathway is real. The authorization transfer that Marsh is building with me, that's real. You can't look at what's in this command right now and say it was manufactured. We know that," Daniel said. "The question is whether the documentation is strong enough that nobody outside this base can mischaracterize it." Greer was quiet. Then he said something that surprised Daniel. "I want to talk to the Admiral," he said. Daniel paused. "About what?" "About this. About the complaint at the other base. He should know." Greer looked at him steadily. "He's not going to hear about it from Whitmore's office tonight. He should hear it from us." Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go with you." They found Voss in the command center at 8 o'clock, reviewing the updated communication protocol that Torres and Marsh had submitted that afternoon. He looked up when they came in. He took in their expressions. "Sit down," he said. They told him. He listened the way he had learned over 17 days to listen without interrupting, without jumping to the response before the information was finished, with the specific patience of a man who had discovered that the information was almost always more complete than whatever he'd assumed it was going to be at the beginning. When they finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. "The other commander filed a formal complaint," he said. "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "Against an evaluation that identified the same systemic conditions this evaluation identified." "That's our understanding." Voss looked at the table. Then he looked up. "Where is Colonel Hayes right now?" "Her office," Daniel said. "Working on the structural recommendation document." Voss stood up. "Come with me," he said. They walked to Elena's office together, the three of them, and Daniel thought about the distance between this moment and the morning of the exercise, when these two people had stood on opposite sides of a command tent, and one of them had laughed, and the other had not flinched, and the entire base had watched and drawn their conclusions, and been wrong about almost all of them. Voss knocked on Elena's open door. She looked up. She saw all three of them. Something moved in her face. "Admiral," she said. "I know about the complaint," he said. He sat down without waiting to be asked. "Tell me what you need from this command to protect the evaluation." She looked at him for a moment. "I need a formal command attestation," she said. "Your signature documenting the changes implemented since day one with specific dates and outcomes. It carries more weight than field personnel testimony alone, because it puts the accountability on the commander rather than the evaluation. It says in your words, and over your signature, that the evaluation findings were accurate and that the command response was genuine." He said, "Write the template. I'll sign it tonight." She was still looking at him. "You understand," she said carefully, "that signing that attestation creates a permanent record of what this command looked like before the evaluation. Your own signature confirms the findings." "I know what it confirms," he said. "It will be in the case file, the training case. Every command in this region." "I know," Voss said. His voice was completely steady. "The findings are accurate," he said. "I built a culture that made it expensive for people to tell me the truth. I didn't know I was doing it. That doesn't make it less true." He paused. "If my signature on an accurate document protects the evaluation and protects the changes we've built here, and make sure that other commands have a real chance at fixing the same problems, then that's what my signature is for. Daniel Carter sat in that office at 8:15 in the evening on day 17 and understood that he was watching something he would spend the rest of his career trying to put into words for people who hadn't been there to see it. Not heroism. Nothing that dramatic. Just a man deciding quietly and without audience, and without anyone requiring it of him to be honest about himself. "Write the template," Voss said again. Elena opened a blank document. She started writing. The formal complaint review from Whitmore's office came back on day 19. No merit found. The other base's evaluation would resume with a different evaluating officer, which was its own complicated story. But the immediate pressure on the regional evaluation program was released. Elena read the one-paragraph summary standing in her office at 7 in the morning, and then set it down and went to find Torres to tell her, because Torres had been carrying the weight of the possible reversal for 2 days, with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else, and she deserved to know first. Torres said, "Good," with a brevity that contained approximately 47 things she had decided not to say, and went back to her file. Elena went back to work, but the complaint, even resolved, even dismissed, had changed something in the last days of the 30-day window. It had made visible what had been operating as assumption, that what was built here could be taken apart. That it was not permanent simply because it felt real. That the distance between real change and documented change was a distance that had to be crossed deliberately, not assumed. So they crossed it deliberately. Torres's file was formally incorporated into the base's maintenance record system on day 20, with Chambers signing as logistics coordinator and Ruiz listed as contributing author. Ruiz, who had spent 9 years keeping informal records in a personal notebook that lived in the bottom drawer of his workstation, stood in the logistics office and watched his name go into an official document and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, 9 years, to no one in particular. Chambers, standing next to him, said, "I know." The new reporting pathway 4-hour escalation to relevant department head for technical and safety concerns processed its first fully clean cycle on day 21. No delays. No routing failures. 3 reports and 3 responses out, all within the window. Greer sent Elena a one-line message that said, "Simply clean cycle." She kept it. On day 22, Marsh and Greer completed their 4th structured handoff session. Greer emerged from it knowing things about the communication system's history that had lived exclusively in Marsh's head for 12 years. Marsh emerged from it having discovered through the process of explaining his knowledge to someone who asked sharp questions. 3 assumptions he had held about the system that he had never examined, and 2 of which, upon examination, turned out to be wrong. He filed a correction notice. Elena marked it in the attestation. Voss signed the day 23 version of the document, the most current incorporating everything up to that point with a pen. He held still for a moment before putting it to paper, and then signed clearly without hesitation and handed it back. On day 26, General Whitmore came back, not unannounced this time. He had given 48 hours notice, which was its own signal, not an emergency visit, not a crisis response, a formal review. The kind that arrived with appropriate protocol and left with documented findings. He spent 3 hours at the base. He talked to Torres and Ruiz and Chambers. He reviewed the file and the new reporting pathway records and the authorization protocol. He spent 30 minutes with Voss in a closed meeting that Elena was not part of because it was not her meeting. Then he walked into Elena's office and sat down. "The attestation," he said. "Yes, sir." He signed it voluntarily. "On day 17, she said, the night we learned about the complaint." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "That's not a common response to the threat of an evaluation challenge," he said. "No, sir." Elena agreed. He looked at her. 31 commands, he said. "Yes, sir." "How many commanding officers have signed an attestation confirming adverse findings about their own command culture?" She thought about it. 4, she said. "And of those 4, 3 went on to command at higher levels," she said. "1 retired at his current rank by choice on his own timeline." Whitmore nodded slowly. He was doing the math that she had already done and arriving at the same place. "The training case," he said. "I want it released to the regional curriculum within 60 days. "I'll have the final draft to your office by end of week," she said. He stood. He was at the door when he stopped, which was becoming. Elena noted privately a pattern in how the honest men of this base took their leave. "You've been doing this for 12 years, he said. "Yes, sir." "And you still take 30 days. He paused. "Most evaluators file their report in 10. Most evaluations don't have time to find out whether the changes are real," she said, "or whether the people who made them will still be making them in week 3 when the urgency has worn off and nobody is watching." She paused. "I stay until I know." He nodded. "Good," he said, and left. The last conversation happened on day 29, one day before Elena's scheduled departure from Redstone Base. The recommendation document was filed. The attestation was submitted. The training case draft was in Whitmore's office. The structural changes were documented, implemented, and running on their third clean week. She found Daniel Carter at the northwest rotation point at 6 in the morning. He was there again, the same place she had found him on day 8, watching the same rotation with the same focused attention. But the thing he was watching for was different now. She stood next to him. "Okafor briefed the full team," Daniel said. "Last week. Official briefing on the record about the rotation gap and what to watch for until the adjustment takes effect next quarter." He paused. "He told me afterward that he should have known about it 14 months ago, and that he was sorry he hadn't made it easier to tell him." "What did you say?" Elena asked. "I told him the system made it hard and that wasn't on him." Daniel paused. "Then I told him the system was changing, and that it was partly on him to make sure it kept changing." She looked at him. "He agreed," Daniel said. They stood in silence for a moment. "You're leaving tomorrow," he said. "Yes." "What happens to this place without you here?" It was the same question he had asked in the vehicle bay on day 14, in a different form, with a different weight behind it, now that the answer actually mattered. She turned to look at him directly. "Torres keeps the file," she said. "Greer and Marsh keep building the handoff. Ruiz keeps contributing to the equipment record. Chambers keeps reading it. The new reporting pathway keeps running clean cycles, and when it doesn't, whoever catches the failure files a report, and someone responds within 4 hours." She paused. "And Voss keeps walking around." Daniel was quiet. "And you," she said. "You stay." He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not what I mean." She paused, choosing the words carefully the way she chose most things, not for elegance, but for accuracy. "You identified a problem 14 months ago, when the culture of this command told you it wasn't worth pushing. You pushed anyway. You filed the report. You put it on record." She paused. "When I arrived here, I found 4 independent field assessments that had contributed to the regional review. Yours was the most specific, the most detailed, the most current in its understanding of what the gap looked like and what the consequences would be." He stared at her. "You didn't know that," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't tell you. I should have told you sooner." She held his gaze. "You were right 14 months ago. You were right in the debrief. You were right on day 8 and day 17 and every time in between when you pushed for something that needed to be pushed for." She paused. "Don't stop." He was quiet for a long moment. "Is that an order?" he said, and there was something in it that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "It's an observation," she said. "I document what I see." He looked at the rotation point where Okafor's team was moving through the changeover with the slightly different quality of attention that comes from people who now know why what they're doing matters. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. The day you walked into the command tent, before the exercise." He paused. "You knew how Voss would react. You knew he'd dismiss you. You knew the room would follow his lead." "Yes," she said. Didn't that? He stopped. Started again. Wasn't it hard? Standing there while 60 people laughed because he laughed. While he called me a brat? She said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Not a hesitant quiet, a considering one. The first time someone dismissed me in a command briefing, she said, I was 28 years old. A full colonel told me my analysis was premature and asked if I'd gotten lost on the way to the administrative office. She paused. I went back to my temporary quarters that night, and I sat with it for a long time. The anger, the humiliation, the very specific feeling of being seen as less than you are by someone who has the authority to make that perception matter. Daniel listened, and then I thought about what I was looking at, she said. The command I was evaluating, the things I had found that nobody else had noticed yet, the maintenance gaps and the information failures and the soldiers who knew things and couldn't get anyone to listen. She paused. And I realized that what I was feeling was real and also completely beside the point. Because the people in that command needed what I was looking at to matter. They needed it documented and reported and acted on, and the colonel's opinion of me was not going to change what I was looking at. She looked at Daniel. Truth doesn't get weaker when people refuse to believe it, she said. It just waits. He held that for a moment. That's what you told me once, he said, in different words, on the first day. Yes, she said. I thought it sounded like something you say to survive being dismissed, he said. I didn't understand that you actually meant it as a strategy. It's both, she said. The best strategies usually are. The first twist of the final day came at 9 in the morning, when the formal transfer document from Whitmore's office arrived and everyone who read it stopped for a moment. The evaluation findings at Redstone Base had been classified as exemplary remediation. Not standard, not acceptable, exemplary. The specific language which Elena had not written and had not requested noted that the command had demonstrated measurable cultural and structural improvement within the evaluation window that exceeded regional benchmarks. It noted the voluntary attestation. It noted the Torres-Ruiz equipment record integration. It noted the clean reporting pathway cycles. And it noted in a paragraph that Elena read twice that the evaluation's methodology, the unannounced observational assessment with embedded crisis conditions, had been validated by the Redstone outcomes and would be recommended for adoption as a regional evaluation standard. She set the document down. She had been doing this for 12 years, and she had never had a methodology formally adopted by a general's office before. She sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she went back to the departure preparation. But Torres found her at 10 o'clock and said, I read the transfer document, and her voice had a quality that Elena hadn't heard in it before, something slightly undone at the edges. Yes, Elena said. It says the methodology is going to other commands. Yes. What we built here, the file, the reporting pathway, the authorization transfer, those are going to be the model. A version of them, Elena said. Adapted for each command's specific context. Torres was quiet. That means other Torreses, she said finally. Other people who filed reports that got deprioritized. Other specialists who ran unauthorized drills because it was the only way to protect their teams. She paused. They're going to have a pathway. That's the intention, Elena said. Torres nodded. She looked at her station. She looked back. Thank you, she said. And then, because she was Torres and she was precise, not for the methodology, for the coffee, day one. The Admiral brought it to my station, and I thought for 1 second that something had gone wrong and he was there to tell me, and then he just asked me to show him. She paused. I've been at this station for 3 years, and nobody above logistics coordinator level had ever visited it before that morning. It sounds like a small thing. It wasn't, Elena said. No, Torres said. It wasn't. The second twist came at 2 in the afternoon. Voss called a base-wide assembly. Not a standard formation, those were scheduled. This was called with 2 hours' notice, and the entire personnel of Redstone Base assembled in the main yard with the specific energy of people who know something significant is about to happen, but don't know its shape yet. Elena stood at the side, not at the front. Voss stood at the front. He looked at 5,000 people. The same 5,000 who had watched a young woman walk into the tactical zone 29 days ago. The same 5,000 who had heard him laugh. The same 5,000 who had watched the exercise collapse and watched someone they had underestimated take control of a display table and rebuild a broken operation from pieces. He spoke without notes. 29 days ago, he said, this command failed an exercise in front of all of you, and I failed it before you did because I had been told it would fail and I didn't listen. He paused. I told a colonel who outranked me in analytical competence by a distance I'm still calculating that she was a brat. I said it in front of 60 officers, and I intended it to humiliate her and close the conversation. Another pause. She was right. I was wrong. The exercise proved it in the most visible possible way, and I'm not going to dress that up as anything other than what it was. The assembly was absolutely still. This command has spent the last 29 days changing, he said. Not because we were ordered to change, though we were. Not because a general watched the exercise in real time and arrived the next day, though he did. Because the people in this command, Torres and Greer and Ruiz and Willard and Chambers and Okafor and Carter and Marsh and every person who filed a report that didn't go anywhere and kept showing up anyway because those people had been trying to build a better command inside the one they were given, and they deserved a command structure that met them halfway. Something moved through the assembly. Not sound, nobody spoke. A physical thing. The collective shift of 5,000 people exhaling at the same moment. We're not done, Voss said. We have a new reporting pathway and a new authorization structure and a 37-page equipment file and a clean cycle record. And we have, as of this morning, a methodology that's going to other commands in this region, because what we built here worked. But none of that is a destination. It's a direction. He paused. And the direction depends on every person in this command continuing to do the thing that Torres did, file the report. Raise the concern. Say the thing that needs to be said through the channel that's now open to receive it. He looked out at all of them. I will not laugh. I will not dismiss you. I will not call you lost because you walked into a room I didn't expect you to be in. He paused. This command is better than it was 30 days ago. We're going to keep making it better. That's the job. He stepped back, and Elena Hayes, standing at the side of a base-wide assembly she had not been told about and had not organized and had not scripted, stood very still and let the moment be what it was. She left the next morning at 7. Not a ceremony. She had been specific about that. No formation, no formal send-off. Nothing that made the departure into an event when the work was the event, and the departure was just what happened when the work was done. Daniel walked her to the vehicle. They had said most of what needed saying over 29 days, and they both knew it. So the walk was quiet. The good kind of quiet that exists between people who have gotten past the requirement for noise. She put her bag in the vehicle. She turned to him. Write the report, she said. He looked at her. Which report? The one you've been thinking about for 14 months, she said. The full analysis of what the northwest rotation gap revealed about information flow in this command. Not the field observation you filed, the real one. The one you've been building in your head since the day your supervisor told you it wasn't worth pushing. She paused. Write it now. Submit it through the new pathway. Let it go into the system under your name on record with dates. She held his gaze, not because anyone is asking for it, because it's accurate and it deserves to exist. He nodded slowly. And after that, he said. After that, she said, you keep doing what you've been doing. You pay attention. You say what needs to be said. You make it easier for the people around you to do the same. She picked up the last bag. And in about 3 years, when you're running your own unit, You visit your diagnostic specialist's station at 6:47 in the morning. You bring 2 cups of coffee. You ask her to show you what's in the maintenance log. She paused. And you listen. He stood there for a moment. 3 years, he said. You're that certain. I've been doing this for 12 years, she said. I know what I'm looking at. She got in the vehicle. He watched it pull away. He stood in the early morning quiet of Redstone Base and watched it go until it was gone, and then he stood there a moment longer in the place where it had been. Then he went inside. He sat down at his desk. He opened a new document. He began to write. 3 years later, Lieutenant Daniel Carter was promoted to captain and given command of the Northwest Sector Rotation Unit, the same unit whose structural gap he had identified on his first month at Redstone. The same gap whose correction had taken 14 months to implement, and whose documentation had become a footnote in a training case used by every command in the region. His first week in the role, he scheduled a diagnostic review of all equipment systems in his unit. His second week, he established a direct reporting pathway for his 3 junior specialists with a guaranteed 4-hour response window. His third week, he visited his communications specialist at 6:47 in the morning. Her name was Reyes. She had been at the unit for 8 months, and she had a notebook in her bottom drawer. He brought 2 cups of coffee. He asked her to show him what was in the notebook. She stared at him for a moment, in the way Torres had stared at Voss. The stare of a person recalibrating rapidly in the direction of something they had stopped expecting. Then she opened the notebook, and Daniel Carter, who had learned what he knew from watching a woman stand still while a room laughed at her, and say the thing that needed to be said without flinching, without hesitating, without waiting for the room to decide she was worth listening to, Daniel Carter sat down, and he listened. Because that was the lesson that had traveled from that morning on the training field, through 29 days of difficult, unglamorous real work, and out into the world, through every command that read the case file, and every specialist who finally had a pathway, and every lieutenant who filed the report instead of putting it in a drawer. Not that one woman had walked into a room and changed it, but that the room had always been capable of changing. It had simply been waiting for someone to show it how.